The morning Joseph Shelby rode into Caldwell, Kansas. The townsfolk pressed themselves against storefronts and watched him pass like a storm rolling in off the open plain, silent and inevitable, and charged with something no one quite wanted to name. It was the autumn of 1878, and the cattle drives were slowing with the season, the last great herds having already pushed north along the Kishom Trail. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Indian Territory line like a man leaning too far over a cliff, half respectable and half something else entirely. A border town that had seen enough blood and dust and broken promises to last 3 lifetimes. Joseph Shelby fit that description more than he would ever care to admit. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that men who work hard and eat little tend to be, with dark hair that curled just slightly at the temples, and eyes the particular shade of gray-green that made people think of deep well water, cold and still and unfathomably deep. He wore a single Colt revolver on his right hip, a battered leather coat that had seen more miles than most men twice his age, and an expression that communicated, with extraordinary efficiency, that he was not interested in conversation, community, or company of any kind. He had a reputation, though not the kind that came from gunfighting or outlawry. Joseph Shelby's reputation was quieter and, in its own way, more unnerving. People said he had come back from somewhere he would not name, and that whatever he had seen there had closed something inside him like a door being shut against winter. He had worked the ranches south of Wichita for 3 years, riding fence lines alone, sleeping under open sky, turning down every supper invitation and every Sunday service welcome with the same polite, immovable refusal. He was, according to everyone who had tried and failed to know him, simply unreachable. He tied his horse, a dun gelding named Cutter, to the post outside the general store and went inside for tobacco and dried beans and a pound of salt pork. He did not make eye contact with the man behind the counter. He counted his coins carefully and took his change and was halfway to the door when the sound of a wagon rolling too fast down the main street made him pause. The wagon was a plain-sided affair, loaded with traveling trunks and what appeared to be an entire library of crates, pulling hard to the left because one of the traces had come loose, and the horse drawing it was beginning to panic. The driver was a young woman, and she was not panicking. That was the first thing Joseph noticed about Edna Fairchild. The chaos around her was absolute, and she was sitting up straight in the middle of it, reins gathered in both hands, voice low and firm as she spoke to the frightened animal with a calm that seemed almost unreasonable given the circumstances. Joseph was in the street before he had consciously decided to move. He caught the horse's bridle at a run, planting his feet, letting the animal's momentum carry into him rather than fighting it outright, and he spoke the same kind of low, measured words he had heard the woman using, a low, steady stream of sound that meant nothing specific and everything general, the kind of language horses understood better than anything else. The animal blew hard through its nostrils and slowed and stopped. The woman set the brake and looked down at him. She was, Joseph estimated, somewhere around 26 or 27, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a practical knot that had lost several pieces to the wind. Her face was angular and thoughtful, with high cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it was accustomed to making decisions. She was dressed for travel in a sensible brown wool dress, and a coat that had clearly been bought for function rather than fashion. Her eyes were brown, warm and direct, the kind of eyes that looked at you as though they intended to actually see you. "Thank you," she said, and her voice had a quality to it, not soft exactly, but considered, each word placed with the care of someone who had learned that words mattered. The trace slipped at the corner and Marcus here decided that was the end of the world. "He's young," Joseph said, still holding the bridle, feeling the horse settle under his hand. "Probably hasn't seen many towns. "Neither have I honestly," she said, and she smiled, and Joseph Shelby, who had not been caught off guard by anything in the better part of 4 years, felt something in his chest shift approximately 2 inches to the left and did not know what to do with that. He stepped back from the horse and looked away. "You need that trace refastened," he said. "I know. I was hoping someone at the livery would help. I can do it now if you'll hold him steady." She came down from the wagon seat with easy, practiced movements. No waiting to be helped, no hesitation. She simply climbed down and went to the horse's head and began to speak to the animal in the same low voice she had been using before, one hand on his nose, steady and unhurried. Joseph refastened the trace, checking the leather for wear, finding 2 other places where it was thin enough to worry about, and he said so. "This strap here and this one. They'll hold for now, but you shouldn't push your luck past the next town." She came around the side of the wagon and examined the places he pointed to with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in understanding rather than simply being told. She pressed her thumb against the worn leather and nodded. "I can get new traces at the livery. Should be able to." "Thank you," she said again, and this time she extended her hand. "Edna Fairchild. I'm taking up the teaching position at the Caldwell schoolhouse." He looked at her hand for a moment, then shook it. Her grip was firm. "Joseph Shelby. Are you from here, Mr. Shelby?" "No." She waited, clearly expecting more, and when more did not come, she simply absorbed the absence of it without embarrassment. "Well," she said, "it seems I owe you. Is there anything I can do to repay the kindness?" "No need," he said, and he touched the brim of his hat and walked back toward the general store to retrieve the tobacco he had left on the counter. He did not look back. He was very deliberate about not looking back. He failed twice. Edna Fairchild had come to Caldwell from Lawrence, Kansas, which was 200 miles east and might as well have been another continent for the difference in character. Lawrence was a university town, progressive and complicated, still carrying the scars of the border war raids from decades before, still arguing over what the prairie ought to become. Edna had grown up there, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died of fever when Edna was 14, and she had learned to read difficult texts and ask difficult questions and sit comfortably with difficult silences. She had also learned, somewhere along the way, that the world had very specific ideas about what a woman of 26 ought to be doing with her life, and that those ideas centered almost entirely around the acquisition of a husband and the management of a household. She had tried to find this appealing and had failed. What she wanted, stubbornly and without apology, was useful work and a life that felt genuinely her own. The teaching post in Caldwell had been advertised in the Lawrence newspaper in late August, and she had applied without telling her aunt, who would have been alarmed, and had received the acceptance letter within 2 weeks. She had packed her books, her teaching materials, her father's pocket watch, and one good dress she never wore, and she had come west. She settled into the rooms the school board had arranged for her above the dry goods store, 2 small rooms with a good southern window, and a cast-iron stove that required considerable coaxing, and she opened school the following Monday morning with 11 students ranging from 6 to 14, and a determination that surprised even herself. She did not think about Joseph Shelby. Or rather, she thought about him the way you think about something peripheral, something just at the edge of your attention that keeps drawing your eye without your permission. She learned from Mrs. Haverson at the dry goods store, who learned things with the efficiency of a telegraph wire, that Joseph Shelby was a ranch hand hired seasonally by Doyle Garrett, who ran cattle on a stretch of land 4 miles south of town. He came into Caldwell rarely. He drank at the saloon occasionally, but not excessively. He kept to himself with a consistency that people had stopped interpreting as unfriendliness, and had simply accepted as his nature, the way you accept weather. Edna was not particularly interested in this information. She told herself this firmly. 3 weeks into her time in Caldwell, on an October afternoon when the air had begun to carry the first real edge of cold, she found Joseph Shelby sitting outside the feed store, mending a length of bridle, with the focused quietude of a man entirely comfortable in his own company. She had her arms full of books she was transporting from the school to her rooms, and she nodded to him when she passed, and he nodded back, and she continued on. And that would have been that, except that two of the books slipped from the top of the stack and fell into the dirt. She stopped and looked at them and at her arms, still full, and calculated the problem. He came off the step without a word and collected the two books from the ground, brushing the dust from their covers with the back of his hand, and he read the titles as he did it. She could tell he was reading them because his eyes moved across the spines in a way that was not incidental. "Geology of the Western Territories," he said. "For a lesson on the land the children are living on," she said. "And the other one is about native grasses. I thought if they understood what grew here and why, they might understand the land itself better." He handed the books back, setting them carefully on top of her stack. "That's not the usual curriculum," he said. "No," she agreed. "But the usual curriculum was written by people who had never been west of the Ohio River, so I'm improvising." Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible, but she caught it. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "Good luck with it," he said, and returned to his step. She walked on, and this time she was the one who didn't look back, and she was less successful at it than he had been. The thing about Joseph Shelby that no one in Caldwell knew, because he had not told anyone and did not intend to, was that he had once been a different kind of man entirely. He had grown up in Missouri, in a family that valued books and argument and the considered exchange of ideas, and he had studied at a small college in Columbia until the war tore through everything like a hand reaching into a pocket and turning it inside out. He had served, and he had survived, and the surviving had cost him things he could not quite enumerate even now, 15 years later. He had come west after the war ended, following the trail that many men like him had followed, men who found that the life they had expected to return to no longer quite existed, or that they themselves no longer quite fit inside it. He had worked cattle and he had worked horses, and he had learned to be quiet in the way that the land itself was quiet, vast and indifferent, and oddly comforting in its indifference. He had loved someone once. Her name had been Clara, and she had died of cholera in the summer of 1871, and he had buried her on the Kansas plain under a sky so blue it seemed like a mockery. And he had decided then, with the particular clarity that grief sometimes produces, that he was done opening himself to anything that could be taken away. He had been faithful to that decision for 7 years. He was finding, in the October of 1878, that faithfulness to a decision was considerably harder to maintain than he had anticipated. He had begun to watch for Edna Fairchild's movements through town without quite meaning to. The way she walked with a purposeful, unhurried stride. The way she stopped to speak to people not because she was performing friendliness, but because she appeared to be genuinely interested in them. The way she argued good-naturedly with the school board chairman, Mr. Hutchins, on the steps of the town hall over whether the school needed more reading materials, a conversation Joseph overheard from across the street while pretending to examine a saddle in the window of the leather shop. "Children in a border town need literature as much as any children in Boston," she was saying, her tone perfectly pleasant and completely immovable. "Perhaps more, because they're growing up in a place where the story of what this land is going to be is still being written, and they should know how to read and write and think so they can be part of writing it." Hutchins was a large man who was accustomed to having the last word, and he was clearly struggling. "Mrs. Fairchild, Miss Fairchild," she corrected, not sharply, just accurately. "Miss Fairchild, the budget. I'll donate the books myself," she said. "I'm simply asking permission to use them." He gave it. Of course he gave it. Joseph could have told him from 40 yards away that he was going to give it. November came in with its teeth already showing. The temperature dropped over the course of a single week, the grass going from brown to frost pale, the sky taking on that low gray ceiling that meant serious weather was considering its options. The cattle work was winding down for the season, and Doyle Garrett had already let 2 of his hands go. Joseph knew he would likely be offered winter work, reduced wage, maintaining the property and the remaining stock through the cold months, and he expected to take it. He had not spoken to Edna Fairchild since the afternoon with the books, and he thought this was probably correct. Then, on a Friday evening in the first week of November, he walked into the hotel dining room for supper, which he did perhaps once a month when the pull of something hot and properly cooked became greater than his preference for solitude. And she was there, sitting alone at a corner table with a book open beside her plate, eating stew and reading with the comfortable concentration of someone entirely at ease with her own company. Every other table in the room had at least 2 people at it. He looked at the empty tables and then at his options and made the objectively logical choice to take one of them, and he was sitting down at the table nearest the window, back to the wall as was his habit, when she looked up from her book and saw him and said from across the room, "Mr. Shelby, you're welcome to join me if you'd like. The stew is excellent and the book is Middlemark, which I've read 4 times and could discuss for roughly 3 hours, or not at all, depending on your preference." He sat with her. He was not entirely certain how that had happened, only that it had, and that the stew was in fact excellent, and that she was telling the truth about both the book and the flexibility of her conversational expectations. She ate with appetite and read while he settled in and did not make conversation until it became apparent that he was not actually opposed to it, at which point they talked about the book for 20 minutes and then somehow about the land south of Caldwell and the way the light changed in autumn, and then about the nature of silence, which she found interesting as a subject. "I grew up in a house full of noise," she said. "My father talked constantly. Books, ideas, arguments with himself. I loved it, but I've found out here that I understand silence better than I expected to. I think it teaches you to listen differently." "What do you mean?" He had not planned to ask a question. It came out anyway. "In Lawrence, everything was already interpreted for you. Someone always told you what things meant. Out here, the land doesn't explain itself, and so you have to decide for yourself what you're seeing. I find that I trust my own judgment more when I'm not surrounded by other people's opinions." She paused. "That probably sounds strange." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She looked at him with those direct brown eyes, and he looked back, and the moment extended longer than was strictly comfortable, and then she looked down at her book and turned a page she had clearly already read. "I heard," she said, keeping her eyes on the page, "that you've been here 3 seasons. About that, do you plan to stay?" "I hadn't thought that far." She nodded slowly, as though this answer confirmed something she had already worked out. "I'm staying," she said. "I decided last week. The children are worth staying for. This place is worth staying for. I know it's rough and there are things about it that are genuinely hard, but there's something real here." "I'd rather have something real than something comfortable." Joseph said nothing. He turned his water glass in a slow circle on the table. "I've probably been talking too much," she said. "No," he said, "you haven't." They were the last people in the dining room when the proprietor's wife began very pointedly wiping down empty tables around them. And they both noticed at the same time, and the moment of shared recognition, the small comedy of it, produced from Joseph Shelby, the first genuine laugh that had come out of him in so long. He had genuinely forgotten what the sound was supposed to feel like. It startled him enough that he stopped immediately, as though he had done something indiscreet. Edna Fairchild was looking at him as though she had just watched something rare and unexpected, a shooting star or a red fox in open daylight. There was nothing of pity in her expression and nothing of performance. There was only the kind of careful, warm attention that she seemed to give everything she thought was worth her time. "Good night, Mr. Shelby," she said, gathering her book and rising from the table. "Thank you for the company. Good night, Miss Fairchild." She walked out, and he sat for another moment with his empty coffee cup, aware with absolute certainty that something had changed, and unsure whether he was grateful or terrified, and concluding that the answer was probably both. The following week he rode past the schoolhouse on his way back from the southern pasture and heard her voice through the open door, reading aloud to the children. And he stopped Cutter without thinking about it and sat in the saddle listening for 3 full minutes to the sound of Edna Fairchild reading from a book about the rivers of the Western Territories, her voice clear and warm, and carrying the kind of genuine enthusiasm that made even the driest subject feel like it mattered. One of the children, a small girl with braids, appeared in the doorway and looked at him with frank curiosity. He moved on before anyone else noticed him, but he thought about it. He thought about it for the 3 hours it took him to ride out to the garret-lined fence and back, and he did not stop thinking about it when he returned to his bunk in the hands' quarters, and he lay awake for an unreasonable amount of time staring at the low ceiling and deciding firmly to stop thinking about it. He lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, he rode into town on the pretext of needing a new can of lamp oil, which was true but was not the actual reason he went. And he managed, through no particular plan of his own, to cross paths with Edna on the boardwalk outside the post office, where she was reading a letter with the kind of expression that meant the news in it was not good. He almost kept walking. He stopped. "Is everything all right?" he asked. She looked up. The expression took a moment to settle into something more neutral. "My father is unwell," she said. "Influenza. He says it isn't serious, but my father has a strong philosophical opposition to admitting when things are serious, so it's difficult to calibrate. Is there someone with him? My aunt. She'll take care of him." She folded the letter carefully, pressing the creases with 2 fingers. "He would tell me not to come back, even if I wanted to. He's very proud of me being here." She said this last part quietly, as though she was speaking it as much to herself as to him. "He should be," Joseph said, and was immediately and deeply surprised at himself. Edna looked up at him again, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the cold November wind moved down the street carrying the smell of wood smoke and frost and the distant musk of cattle, and Joseph Shelby stood on the boardwalk of a town he had never intended to matter to him and felt the door he had closed very deliberately 7 years ago strain against its hinges. "Would you like some coffee?" she said. "Mrs. Haverson has a stove going and she doesn't mind the company. I was going to stop in anyway." "I'd like that," he said. This, he later thought, was the moment. Not the wagon, not the supper, not the laugh that had surprised him. This was the moment, the small deliberate yes, the choosing to step through a door rather than stand outside it. He had said yes to so few things for so long that the word felt strange in his mouth, new and slightly dangerous, like handling something you were not sure was safe. Mrs. Haverson's dry goods store was warm and smelled of coffee and cinnamon, and the particular dusty sweetness of fabric bolts, and she was a comfortable woman in her 50s, who welcomed them with the pleased efficiency of someone who had been hoping for exactly this combination of people, and was going to take careful note of every detail. She poured coffee without being asked, and produced a plate of dried apple cookies, and retreated to the back room with a transparency that was almost touching. They sat at the counter on 2 stools and drank the coffee, and Edna told him about her father and the books he'd taught her to love, and Joseph listened with the whole of his attention, which was something he rarely gave, and which Edna seemed to receive with no more or less than its appropriate weight, not making too much of it and not dismissing it. He told her in return, carefully, and without going further than he intended, that he had grown up in Missouri and that his family had valued education. He told her that he had attended college briefly. He did not tell her about the war or about Clara. He was not ready for that, and he trusted that she understood this without being told, because she did not press him, and her eyes, when he spoke, held the particular quality of someone who knows that what they're hearing is the surface of a much deeper water. "What do you do out there on the ranch?" she asked. Actually do, day to day. No one had ever asked him that. He considered it. Right now, mostly fence riding and tending the remaining stock, making sure the water sources are clear before the freeze, checking shelter conditions for the cattle that'll winter here. It's quiet work. "Do you like it?" "I like that it needs doing and I know how to do it." That's not the same as liking it. No, he said, it isn't. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him with that steady, patient attention. What do you like, Mr. Shelby? The question sat between them, simple and enormous. I used to read a great deal, he said. It came out sounding more honest than he'd meant it to, more exposed. I haven't in a while. Why not? It stopped feeling like it connected to anything real. She nodded slowly. And now, he looked at his coffee, I've been thinking about it again lately. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have more books than I can reasonably carry if you wanted to borrow something. I'd like that, he said, and there was the word again. Yes, yes, like a door opening one careful inch at a time. The first snow came on the 17th of November, 1878, 2 weeks earlier than anyone had expected. It arrived in the night, quiet and heavy, and by morning Caldwell was blanketed in white that softened all its rough edges and made it look, just briefly, like something out of a different kind of story. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees by dawn, and the wind off the open plain had teeth in it. Joseph had come into town the previous afternoon with Doyle Garrett's freight wagon, picking up a winter supply of feed and equipment. He had planned to return to the ranch that evening, but the snow had made the roads uncertain, and Garrett had told him to stay in town if the weather looked bad, which it had, and so he had taken a room at the hotel and now stood at the window watching the white street below, thinking about the book Edna had lent him 2 days before, a thick volume of essays by a man named John Muir about the mountains and wild spaces of the western country, written with a reverence for landscape that had stopped Joseph cold on the second page and refused to let him go. He had read half of it in one sitting. He had not done that with any book in 9 years. He heard her voice in the hotel lobby before he reached the bottom of the stairs, talking to the proprietor about whether school ought to be canceled for the day given the weather. Her position, which she was advocating with characteristic precision, was that 11 children who lived within 8 blocks of the schoolhouse were perfectly capable of walking through 6 inches of snow, and that she would have the stove running by 8 o'clock. The proprietor looked unconvinced. Joseph appeared at the bottom of the stairs. I can walk with you, he said to Edna, if the worry is the road condition. She turned and looked at him, and in the warm light of the hotel lobby, with the snow reflecting white through the windows, her face was lit in a way that did the thing to his chest again, that 2-inch displacement, and he looked at her steadily and did not look away. I'd appreciate that, she said. They walked through the snow together. The town hushed around them, every sound softened and the air biting clean, and their breath made small clouds that dissolved into the white morning, and they talked about the Muir essays, Edna listening to his analysis with evident pleasure, arguing 2 or 3 of his points with enough precision that he had to think harder to defend them. And he found that he liked this, the push and pull of genuine intellectual exchange, more than he had words for. You've been hiding something, she said as they reached the schoolhouse door. He stopped. What do you mean? She pulled out her key and unlocked the door, looking at him over her shoulder with a slight smile. The way you think, the way you talk about ideas when you let yourself. You've been keeping that in a locked room for a while, haven't you? It wasn't quite a question. Something like that, he said. She pushed the door open. The schoolroom was cold, the window glass edged with frost, and she went directly to the stove and began to lay the fire with efficient, practiced movements. Why? She said, not looking at him, concentrating on the kindling. He stood in the doorway, the cold at his back and the dark schoolroom before him, and he considered the question with the same seriousness he would give to any question that deserved it. Because for a long time, he said, thinking carefully about things only made the weight of them heavier. It was easier not to. She had the fire going, a small bright thing beginning to push light into the room. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. And now, she said, second time she'd asked him that. And now? Now, he said carefully, I think I might have been wrong about that. She held his gaze for a long moment and then nodded once, the way she did when she had received information and processed it and filed it in the correct place. Come in and close the door, she said. You're letting the cold in." He came in and closed the door. He stayed for an hour until the children began to arrive in ones and twos, stamping snow from their boots, and then he excused himself, and she walked him to the door, and they stood for a moment in the threshold with the snow-bright world outside and the warming room behind them. "Joseph," she said, first name. It was the first time, and she said it as naturally as breathing, as though she had been using it for years. He looked at her. "I'm glad you stopped the wagon," she said. "That first day." "So am I," he said. He walked back through the snow to the hotel and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for 5 minutes, trying to work out what exactly was happening to him, and concluding that he knew perfectly well what was happening and that the question was what he intended to do about it. The snow stayed for 3 days, thick enough to make travel difficult but not impossible. And during those 3 days Joseph Shelby was in Caldwell, which meant that by some logic that neither of them was ready to examine too closely. He crossed paths with Edna Fairchild 4 times that he could count, and possibly a 5th that he chose not to count, because it would undermine the pretense that these encounters were coincidental. On the 2nd day of the snow, he helped her carry a load of wood from the pile behind the school to the stack inside, because the outside pile had been iced over and required a hatchet to break apart, and she accepted this help with the same matter-of-fact gratitude she extended to everything, without making it more than it was or less than it was. On the 3rd day, in the evening, he knocked on the door of her rooms above the dry goods store and stood on the landing holding the Muir book. "I finished it," he said when she opened the door. She looked at the book and then at him, and there was something quick and warm in her eyes that she did not entirely conceal. "What did you think?" "I think he's right about what wilderness costs you if you lose it," he said, "and I think the same thing is true about people." She stepped back from the door. "Come in, I'll make tea." The 2 rooms were exactly what you would expect of Edna Fairchild's living space, every inch considered and purposeful, books stacked on every flat surface in systems that made internal sense even if they were not immediately obvious, a worn quilt on the narrow bed that looked like it had been made by someone who loved her, a jar of dried grasses on the windowsill, because she thought the children should be able to see examples of what they were studying, and had begun collecting specimens from the countryside on her walks. He sat in the one armchair and she made tea on the cast-iron stove, and they talked for 2 hours in a way that felt, to both of them, like a conversation they had been in the middle of for some time and had only just found the space to continue. At some point after the 2nd cup of tea she said, "Will you tell me something true about yourself, something you haven't told anyone here?" He looked at the jar of dried grasses on the windowsill. "I lost someone," he said, 7 years ago. "Her name was Clara. She died of cholera, and I buried her, and after that I decided that I was done letting people matter to me." He said it plainly, without drama, the way you state a fact that is simply true. Edna did not fill the silence with sympathy. She held it for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved. "I'm sorry about Clara," she said finally. "Thank you." "And the decision," she said. "How has it served you?" He looked at her. "I thought it was keeping me safe," he said. "I'm beginning to think it was keeping me empty." The fire in the stove made small sounds. Outside, the last of the day's light was fading out of the western sky. "Joseph," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "Yes. I think you should know that I am not a simple undertaking." She looked at him with complete honesty, no softening of it. "I am stubborn and I have opinions about almost everything, and I will argue with you and I will not be managed. And I am not interested in being anyone's idea of what a woman should be. If that sounds like too much, it doesn't," he said. "I haven't finished." "I know, I'm sorry, go ahead." Something that was not quite a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. "And I do not extend myself easily," she said. "I have been careful with myself for a long time, for my own reasons, but I think I am not being careful with you. And that frightens me somewhat, and I'm telling you because I think you should know that I am frightened, but I'm not retreating from it." He was quiet for a long time. "I am terrified," he said at last, "entirely and without reservation, and I'm also here, And I don't know how to do this anymore, it's been so long. But I'd like to learn again if you'd be willing to be patient with me." She looked at him, and in her expression was something so direct and true that he felt it like a hand pressed flat against his sternum. "I think you might find," she said, "that you haven't forgotten as much as you think." He reached across the space between his chair and hers slowly, and he took her hand, and she turned her hand in his and held it, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the fire in the stove burned low and steady, and outside the last snow of the storm was falling soft and quiet over the town. He rode back to the Garrett ranch the next morning when the roads were passable, and the week that followed was one of the strangest of his life because the quiet that had always felt like relief now felt like absence, and the open sky that had always felt like freedom felt, also, like distance. And he recognized these feelings with the resignation of a man who knows that the defenses he has spent years building have been breached so thoroughly that there is no useful purpose in defending what remains. He came back to Caldwell the following Saturday. He came back the Saturday after that. And the Saturday after that he asked Edna Fairchild if she would walk with him, and they walked south of town along the frozen creek where the cottonwoods stood bare and white-barked against the gray sky. And he told her about Missouri and about college and about the war, not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough, the shape of it, the way it had changed the geography of who he was. He told her about coming west and the years of deliberate isolation, and she listened to all of it with the whole of her attention and did not try to fix it or reframe it or console it. She simply received it, held it, acknowledged its weight. And in return she told him about her mother dying and about growing up as the daughter of an absent-minded, brilliant, deeply loving man who had always treated her as his intellectual equal and had never quite noticed that the world outside their house had different expectations. She told him that this had made her both better prepared and worse prepared for reality than most women she knew. Better because she had no fear of thinking. Worse because she kept being surprised when her thoughts were not considered valuable in rooms where women were expected only to listen. "Does that bother you?" he asked. "Out here?" "Less than it did in Lawrence, actually," she said. "I think frontier towns are more interested in whether you can do the work than in whether you're doing it in the right dress." "Not entirely," he said. "The school board, Mr. Hutchins is improving," she said, with the serene confidence of someone winning a long game. "Give me another 6 months." He laughed, and this time he did not stop himself. She looked at him with those warm brown eyes, and the wind lifted a piece of her hair from her hat, and she reached up to pin it back, and he thought, with a clarity that was almost violent, that he was in love with her. That it had been happening since the wagon and the frightened horse and the calm in her voice, and that all the weeks since had been simply the slow working out of something that had been decided in that first moment. He was not ready to say it, but he was done pretending he didn't know it. December arrived, and with it a cold so thorough and committed that the water in the horses' buckets froze solid by midnight, and the mornings were an exercise in the mechanics of surviving serious weather. Doyle Garrett's operation slowed to its winter pace, and Joseph was kept busy with the fundamental work of keeping animals alive in the cold, the carrying of water, the maintenance of the hay supply, the checking and rechecking of shelter and fence in a landscape that had contracted to shades of white and gray and the brown of dead grass. He came to town twice a week, which was more than he had any practical reason to, and he spent those evenings with Edna in ways that had acquired a pleasant domestic rhythm without either of them quite engineering it. They read by the fire in her rooms, trading books back and forth, a system Edna had developed for two people who both read faster than library supply could accommodate. They argued about the essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson, which Edna admired for his thinking and critiqued for his specific blindnesses, and about the question of statehood for Kansas territories, and about whether the children in her class would be better served by more arithmetic or more history, and about the correct way to make cornbread, which Joseph had opinions about that surprised both of them. They went to Sunday services twice, because Edna thought it was important to be part of the community, even when the sermon was the same as last week's, and Joseph sat next to her in the pew, and was aware of the careful attention of every person in the room, and was less bothered by it than he expected. He helped her clear the school walk after a heavy snow, and she brought him food she had made when she cooked too much, which was often because she cooked like her father thought, in quantities designed for more people than were actually present. He had not kissed her. He wanted to, with a constancy that had become background noise. But something in him was still moving slowly, still rebuilding the trust in himself that was required to make that kind of choice, and she seemed to understand this without needing it explained. She was patient in a way that was not passive, patient in the way of someone who knows what they want and is willing to let it arrive in its own time. It was on a Thursday evening in the second week of December that things shifted. He had come to town with a purpose, and the purpose was sitting in his coat pocket in the form of a book he had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita 3 weeks before, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, because she had mentioned once that she had never read Whitman, and that it seemed like a significant gap in her education. And he had thought about it for a week, and then written the letter to the bookseller, and had been not entirely successfully pretending since then that the book's arrival did not matter to him as much as it did. He knocked on her door and she opened it with flour on her hands because she had been making bread, and she looked at him and at the wrapped package in his hand. "What is that?" she said. "Something I ordered for you." He held it out. "It's not a large gift, it's just something I thought you'd like." She wiped her hands on her apron and took the package and unwrapped it with the careful attention she gave to everything, and when she saw what it was, she was quiet for a moment. "Joseph," she said, "I know you mentioned it. That you'd never read him." She looked at the cover of the book and then at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears but was adjacent to them. "Come in," she said. "The bread will take another hour and you can have supper after." He came in and she put the book on the table beside her chair where she would reach for it first, which he noticed, and they sat together in the small warm room while the bread baked and the cold pressed at the windows, and she read him the first 2 poems from the book aloud in her voice that made everything it touched feel more real, and he sat and listened and thought that this exact thing, this warmth and this voice and this woman, was what he had been keeping himself away from for 7 years. And that he had been wrong in the most thorough and costly way, and that he was grateful beyond any capacity for expression that he had stopped the wagon. After supper, after the bread had been eaten and the dishes cleared and they were sitting again by the stove with the last of the evening's warmth around them, he said, "Edna, yes, I need to tell you something, and I'm going to tell you clearly because I've found that is the only way I know how to do things." She set down her cup and looked at him fully, giving him all of her attention. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since approximately the second week of October, though I was the last to know it. I want to be honest about that because you deserve honesty, and because I spent 7 years making myself into someone who didn't say true things, and I don't want to continue to be that person." She looked at him for a long moment. "I love you too," she said. "Since the flower and the geology book, I think, maybe before that." She paused. "I'm not entirely sure what we do with that. I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing. And in the spring, when the season is further along, I'd like to ask you something more specific than that." The warmth in her expression was unmistakable and complete. "Joseph Shelby," she said, "that is the most careful proposal of courtship I have ever heard in my life." "I'm better at careful than at bold," he said. "You're doing all right with bold," she said. And then she leaned forward from her chair and kissed him, gently and deliberately, the way Edna Fairchild did everything, and he held very still for one moment and then kissed her back. And the cold outside was very cold, and the room was very warm, and something that had been locked for 7 years opened quietly and fully and without complaint, like a window being lifted on a spring morning. He walked back to the hotel in the December dark with snow crunching under his boots, and the stars very bright overhead, and a feeling in his chest that he identified, after a moment, as happiness, and which he accepted with the humility of a man who knows that something has been given back to him that he did not altogether deserve. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Joseph Shelby's adult life. He would say this later when asked, and mean it without any reservation. There was nothing dramatic about them. They were composed of the small, renewable materials of ordinary closeness, long evenings of conversation and reading, walks through a town that was locked in December cold, Sunday suppers at the hotel where they sat across from each other and talked for 3 hours, and the proprietor's wife refilled their coffee cups with an expression of proprietary satisfaction. He wrote to Doyle Garrett and asked to stay on through the following spring rather than taking his seasonal wages and moving on, which had been his habit. Garrett wrote back that he'd have been a fool to lose the best fence hand in southern Kansas, and that the arrangement suited him fine. Joseph read the letter and folded it and put it in his coat pocket, and thought for the first time in years about what it meant to stay somewhere. Edna's father wrote in late December to say he was recovered from the influenza, and that the letters she'd sent him about Caldwell and about her work, and carefully embedded in the 4th paragraph of a 5-paragraph letter, about a man named Joseph who seemed to be worth knowing, had made him happier than he had been since she'd left. She read parts of the letter aloud to Joseph and he listened, and when she got to the part about him, he looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone trying not to show that they were moved. "He would like to meet you," she said. "I'd like that," he said. She looked at him over the letter. "Joseph, are you all right?" "I'm very all right," he said. "That's slightly the problem." She laughed, and the sound of her laughing was something he had catalogued without meaning to, the way it came from somewhere genuine, the way it transformed her face, and he thought he could listen to it for the rest of his life and still find it new. On Christmas Day, which fell on a Wednesday in 1878, the town of Caldwell held a small community gathering in the church hall, potluck supper and fiddle music, and the kind of modest, genuine celebration that frontier communities produce from the ingredients of what they have. Joseph and Edna arrived together, which was noticed by everyone and commented on by several people with varying degrees of tact, and they ate the potluck and Edna was pulled into conversation by a group of the school families, and Joseph stood near the door with a plate of food and watched her work the room with the particular grace of someone who is fully themselves in every company. She was wearing the one good dress she had told him she never wore, deep green wool with a cream collar, and her hair was down, which he had not seen before. Dark auburn waves passed her shoulders, and she looked so entirely herself that he thought the room was brighter for her being in it, and felt slightly foolish for thinking this, and thought it anyway. She caught his eye across the hall, and the look she gave him was private and warm, for him only, and he held it for a moment and then looked at his plate because he needed to look somewhere less overwhelming. Tom Prout, one of Garrett's other hands, appeared at Joseph's elbow with a cup of punch and said, with the directness of a man who considers subtlety a waste of good time, "I've known you 3 seasons, Shelby, and I've never seen you look like that." "Like what?" Joseph said. "Like a man who's figured out what he's been working toward." Joseph looked at Edna, who was laughing at something one of the school mothers had said, her head tilted back and the fiddle music weaving around her. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe so." January was hard, the way January on the southern Kansas plain is hard, relentlessly cold, wind driving ice crystals out of a gray sky, the days short and dim, and the work of keeping things alive through the cold taking all available attention. Joseph rode fence lines in temperatures that made his face numb inside 10 minutes, and carried water and pitched hay, and did the 1,000 necessary things that kept a ranch operational in winter. And he came to town twice a week, and sat with Edna in her warm rooms, and they read and talked and argued, and were sometimes quietly together without talking, which is its own kind of intimacy, and one that Joseph had thought he had forgotten how to offer. There was a man in town named Calhoun, Walt Calhoun, who had been in Caldwell since the summer, and ran a small freighting operation, and who had decided, in the way that certain men decide things, that Edna Fairchild was the most interesting woman in Caldwell, and that the most natural course of action was to act on this assessment with very little regard for her own preferences in the matter. He had come to the school twice to speak with her, and had twice been managed with a politeness that was, Edna told Joseph afterward, firm enough that she had hoped it was conclusive. It was not conclusive. Calhoun found Joseph one evening outside the hotel and explained his position, which was that Joseph was a seasonal ranch hand with no particular prospects, and that Edna Fairchild deserved better than what a drifter could offer her. Joseph looked at him for a long moment. "Miss Fairchild decides what she deserves," he said. "Not you, not me, her. I just think she's also very capable of telling you herself if she's interested, which she has clearly chosen not to do. I'd pay attention to that." He said it without heat, which Calhoun seemed to find more unsettling than anger would have been. He said something else, lower and less polite, and Joseph simply walked past him and into the hotel, and did not think about Walt Calhoun again after that because there was nothing in him worth the attention. He told Edna about the conversation the next evening, because he thought she should know, and she listened and said, "Thank you for telling me, and I'm not surprised," and then said, with considerable precision, that she had already sent Mr. Calhoun a letter making her position completely clear, which was that she was not interested, and that she would appreciate him directing his energies elsewhere. Calhoun left Caldwell 2 weeks later to take his freighting operation to Wichita, and Edna returned to her books with the satisfaction of someone who has handled a problem correctly. February arrived and brought with it a thaw, brief and premature, a week of almost warmth that fooled the earliest wildflowers into sending up the first tentative growth before the cold returned, and shut them down again. In that brief warm week, Joseph and Edna walked the creek south of town on a Sunday afternoon, and the ice was cracking, and the cottonwoods were dripping, and the air smelled of mud and the coming of things. She had her hand in the crook of his arm, a habit they had fallen into sometime in December that felt as natural as gravity, and they walked slowly and talked about the spring and what it would bring. She was planning a nature study curriculum for her students, incorporating the grasses and the creek life and the spring migration of birds. He told her about the cattle work that would begin again in March, the early calving, the preparation for the drives. "Will you go north?" she said. "With the drive?" "I hadn't planned to," he said. "I was thinking of asking Garrett if he had work that would keep me in the area." She was quiet for a moment. "Because of me?" "Partly. Also because I'd decided before you that I was done moving. I just hadn't admitted it yet." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Joseph, yes. You said in December that in the spring you wanted to ask me something more specific. I did say that. It's February. It's technically still winter. Barely." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The creek made its ice-cracking sounds, and a crow called somewhere in the cottonwoods, and the mud was soft under his boots, and the sun was doing its best impression of something warmer than it actually was. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small paper-wrapped package, which he had been carrying for 3 weeks waiting for the right moment, and he handed it to her. She unwrapped it. It was a ring, a simple one, gold band with a small garnet, and he had ordered it from the jeweler in Wichita the same day he'd ordered the Whitman, which she didn't know and which would later amuse her considerably. "I ordered these at the same time," he said. "The book and this. I wasn't sure which I'd give you first." She looked at the ring and then at him, and her eyes were very bright. "Edna Fairchild," he said. "I spent 7 years being the kind of man who believed that keeping people out was the same as keeping himself safe. You showed me, without particularly trying, that I was wrong about that. You are the bravest and most honest and most interesting person I have ever known, and I would like very much to spend the rest of my life being known by you and knowing you. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "Yes, Joseph, I will marry you." He took the ring from her hand and placed it on her finger, and she looked at it there, and then she looked at him and stood on her toes and kissed him in the middle of the muddy creek bed with the cottonwoods dripping and the crow still calling its commentary and the thin February sun overhead. And he wrapped his arms around her and held her with the careful wholeness of a man who has learned the value of what he's holding. "I need to write to my father," she said, still close to him. "I need to tell Doyle Garrett I'll be wanting full-time work with a raise in wages," he said. She pulled back and looked at him with bright, laughing eyes. "Will he give it to you?" "I don't know. But I'm not a drifter anymore, apparently, and I need to negotiate accordingly." She laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he held her in the winter sun, and thought that this, too, was happiness, this specific combination of warmth and certainty, and that he would do whatever was required to maintain it. Garrett gave him the raise, which Joseph appreciated, and also offered him the position of ranch foreman, which Joseph had not anticipated and which represented, in the geography of this life he was rebuilding, a meaningful marker of something permanent. The letter to Edna's father, a man named Howard Fairchild, was dispatched the same week as the engagement, and the response came back within 10 days, which was remarkable post-speed, and which suggested Howard Fairchild had written it the moment the letter arrived and ridden it personally to the mail station. The letter was 3 pages long and covered the subjects of his daughter's remarkable character, his own hopes for her happiness, several pointed philosophical observations about the nature of love and commitment derived from the works of people Joseph had actually read, and an invitation to visit Lawrence at the earliest convenient opportunity. Joseph wrote back, which was a thing he did rarely and which took him 2 attempts and a drafted version he tore up, and the letter he sent was straightforward and sincere, and apparently sufficient, because Howard Fairchild's next letter was warmer still and addressed to both of them. They were married on the 14th of March, 1879, on a Saturday morning in the Caldwell church, with the March wind doing its best to ruin everything outside, and the church interior entirely warm and full, because Edna Fairchild had been in town since September and had, in the manner of people who are genuinely interested in other people, become known and loved by most of it. The school families were there, the children scrubbed and combed into their best clothes, sitting with impressive concentration in the front pews. Mrs. Haverson was there and wept through the entire ceremony with great conviction. Doyle Garrett and his wife attended, Garrett looking slightly uncomfortable in his good coat and his wife looking pleased. Tom Prout stood up as Joseph's witness and acquitted himself well. Howard Fairchild had made the journey from Lawrence and sat in the front pew on the bride's side, a thin, bright-eyed man of 60 with Edna's cheekbones and her direct gaze, and he cried quietly through the vows with the dignity of a man who is not remotely ashamed of his feelings. Joseph stood at the altar and watched Edna walk down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing a dress of cream-colored wool that she had made herself, because she had opinions about wedding dresses, and her dark auburn hair was pinned up with the garnet earrings her mother had left her, and she was so entirely herself, so completely and unapologetically present, that he felt the same thing he had felt that first day in the street, that displacement in the chest, but larger now, deeper. The full weight of what she had become to him. She reached him and her father placed her hand in his and looked at Joseph with eyes that said, without words, "Take care of her." And Joseph looked back with eyes that said, without words, "I know what she is worth." The vows were the traditional ones and he meant every word of everyone. She looked at him while she said hers, completely steady, completely certain, and he thought that Edna Fairchild had probably never said anything in her life that she did not fully mean and was not going to start today. They were married, and the March wind blew and the congregation cheered and Mrs. Haverson had to be handed a second handkerchief, and Howard Fairchild embraced his daughter for a long time and then shook Joseph's hand with both of his and told him he was an unusually intelligent man for having recognized something good when he saw it. "She wouldn't let me miss it," Joseph said. Howard looked at him and then at his daughter and smiled. "No," he said, she wouldn't. The spring of 1879 brought the real warmth, slow and earnest. The way spring arrives on the Kansas plain not all at once, but as a series of commitments, each day a little warmer, each week a little greener, until one morning you step outside and the air is full of the smell of new grass, and the meadowlarks are back on the fence posts, and the sky is so wide and blue it seems personal. Edna and Joseph took a house at the south end of Caldwell, a proper house with 4 rooms and a good kitchen, and a garden patch that Edna immediately began planning with the systematic intensity she brought to everything. Joseph built bookshelves for the front room, the largest in the house, running floor to ceiling on 2 walls, because they had between them enough books to require serious infrastructure. She continued to teach. The school board, which is to say Mr. Hutchins, had been going to suggest that a married woman might consider whether her domestic responsibilities would permit continued employment, and had encountered the look in Edna Fairchild's eyes, and had decided that suggesting any such thing would be more trouble than it was worth. By the following year, when her enrollment had grown to 17 students, because families in the area had begun settling with the knowledge that there was a good school, he was thanking his practical good sense. Joseph's work as Garrett's foreman suited him in the way that work suits a man when it uses the full range of what he is, demanding not just physical capability but judgment and planning, and the management of other people with enough fairness that they worked willingly. He rode fence with the hands when it was needed, and sat at the kitchen table with Garrett going over accounts when that was needed, and he was good at both. They wrote to Howard Fairchild regularly, and he wrote back with the enthusiasm of a man who has found something he loves to do, corresponding with his son-in-law about books and ideas in the extended way that Edna, who had grown up with him, knew was his highest expression of acceptance. In the fall of 1879, Howard packed 2 trunks and made the journey to Caldwell and stayed for a month, sleeping in the back room and eating supper with them every evening, and spending his days at the school, helping Edna with the older students and driving the school board to distraction by asking awkward questions about the curriculum in the way that only a man with a lifetime of teaching behind him can. He taught Joseph to play chess, badly at first and then with improving competence in the evenings after supper, and Edna read her books in the armchair by the stove and interjected tactical advice for both sides, which she insisted was impartial and which manifestly was not. When Howard left in October, riding the stage east in the early morning, he embraced Edna for a long time and then took Joseph's hand. "You make her happy," he said. "Not a question." "I try to," Joseph said. "You succeed," Howard said, with the authority of a man who has watched carefully for a month and knows what he is talking about. "Don't stop." He boarded the stage and the stage rolled east, and Joseph and Edna stood in the October morning watching it go until it was past the edge of town. She took his hand. "He loves you," she said. "I know," Joseph said. "The feeling is mutual." She leaned against his shoulder. "Who would have imagined," she said, "you and my father corresponding about Emerson?" "Your father is wrong about Emerson," Joseph said. "You're both wrong about Emerson," she said firmly, "in different and interesting ways." He laughed and she laughed, and they walked back to the house through the October morning, where the leaves on the cottonwood at the corner were going gold, and he thought that the distance between the man he had been and the man he was now was not measurable in miles or years, but in something else, in the willingness to be known, in the courage to let someone matter, in the miracle of a woman on a wagon seat who had looked at a frightened horse and a stranger in the street, and responded to both with the same frank, unhesitating calm. In the spring of 1880, Edna told him she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Sunday morning over coffee, in the straightforward way she did everything, watching his face as she said it. His face did not do anything complicated. His face did the thing it did when he was overwhelmed, which was to go very still and very quiet, and she waited because she knew him. And after a moment he set down his coffee cup and said, "When?" "August," she said. "August, I think." He got up from his chair and came around the table and sat beside her and took both her hands in his and held them and did not say anything for a long moment. And she watched him with the patient certainty of a woman who knows the man she married and knows what his silence means. "I'm scared," he said. "I'm going to tell you that clearly because you've told me you prefer it." "I know," she said. "I'm scared too, that's all right. And I'm very happy," he said, "more than I have the right words for." "That," she said, "is also all right." He lifted her hands and pressed them against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat steady and real. "We're going to be fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I know we are." Their son was born on the 3rd of August, 1880, on a hot Kansas morning with the sun already fierce by 7 o'clock, and the meadowlarks going about their business in the field behind the house. The doctor from Caldwell attended, a competent man named Whitfield who had delivered children in harder conditions than this, and Joseph sat in the front room among the bookshelves for 4 hours doing nothing useful and making Mrs. Haverson, who had come to help, increasingly nervous with his stillness. The baby arrived at 9 in the morning with a strong opinion about the whole business, announced at volume, and Mrs. Haverson appeared in the doorway and said, "Go on then," and Joseph went through the door. Edna was propped against the pillows, hair loose and damp, face tired and entirely radiant in the way that some women are in the first minutes of something enormous and completed. She was holding the baby, who was red-faced and small and producing sounds at a volume that seemed excessive for his size. She looked up at Joseph, and her eyes were full in a way that was different from any fullness he had seen in them before, deeper and more fundamental, the look of someone who has done something they did not quite believe they were capable of until they did it. "Come here," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she laid the baby in his arms with the careful instruction, both hands under, support the head, and he held his son for the first time and looked at this new small person and felt something that had no name and required none. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like someone who disagrees with his current situation," Joseph said. She laughed, exhausted and complete. "What do we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names, several of them, without landing anywhere firm. He looked at the baby and then at her. "Howard," he said, "after your father, if you're willing." She was quiet for a moment. "Howard James Shelby," she said. "James was my grandfather." "That's a good name," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." Little Howard, who almost immediately became Howie except when Edna was making a point, was the kind of child who makes new parents realize they had absolutely no idea what they were getting into, and that this is correct. He was interested in everything, crawling toward every surface that presented a question, pulling books from low shelves with the systematic determination of a researcher, looking at his father with dark gray-green eyes that were unmistakably Joseph's, and at his mother with an expression that was unmistakably hers, that direct assessment that seemed to always be trying to work something out. Joseph wrote to Howard Fairchild the day of the birth, the letter long and somewhat incoherent in its happiness, and Howard Fairchild arrived in Caldwell within 3 weeks and sat in the front room and held his grandson and talked to him as though the baby was a colleague, explaining various features of the room and their significance, and how he regarded him with considerable focus. "He's listening," Howard said, astonished. "He always listens," Edna said from the kitchen, where she was feeding the baby's appetite for her constant attention by cooking something. "He does not always agree." Howard Fairchild came to visit twice a year after that, and in the winter of 1882 he wrote to say that Lawrence had become cold in a way that was less about the weather than about his bones, and Edna and Joseph wrote back together, both of them on the same letter, asking him to come and stay, properly stay, in the room that was his room now, and had been since the month of Howie's birth. He arrived in March of 1883 with 2 trunks of books, several boxes of papers, his chest set, and the expression of a man who knows he has made the right decision and intends to act accordingly. He took up the back room permanently and became part of the household with the ease of someone who has finally come home, teaching at the school alongside Edna 3 days a week, spending his evenings in chess combat with Joseph, spending his mornings with Howie, who was 2.5 and fully ambulatory and deeply verbal and interested in approximately everything. The town of Caldwell had grown in the 4 years since Edna and Joseph arrived in it, grown in the way that border towns grow when the cattle trade is good, and the territory south begins to open, and the school had grown with it, now 22 students, a proper range of ages, a curriculum that had become known in the surrounding settlements as thorough and inventive, and led by a teacher who expected more from her students than convention required, and got it from them anyway. There were things that were hard about those years. There were things that were hard about the territory, about the ongoing troubles of the Indian Territory line, and the complicated injustices of what had been taken from the Comanche and Kiowa peoples to make this Kansas plain available for cattle and settlements. Edna taught her students about this, not hiding it behind comfortable myths, and had a sustained and productive argument with Mr. Hutchins about whether it was appropriate to include this history in the curriculum, an argument she won with a thoroughness that even Hutchins had come to respect as characteristic. There were dry years and difficult years, years when the cattle market moved in ways that were hard on the ranches and hard on the people who depended on them. Doyle Garrett was a fair employer, and Joseph was a good foreman, and the Garrett ranch came through the hard years better than most because of a combination of Garrett's practical wisdom and Joseph's careful management of resources. And Joseph thought sometimes about the men he'd known who hadn't been so fortunate, men scattered by the hard seasons, and he felt the weight of what luck and circumstance meant, the difference between landing somewhere that held and somewhere that didn't. In the spring of 1884, Edna told him she was expecting again, second child. She told him in the same direct way over coffee, watching his face, and this time the stillness that came over him was shorter because he knew it now, knew that he was a man who received good things with stillness rather than noise. When, he said, October. I'll need to speak to Dr. Whitfield. I've already spoken to Dr. Whitfield, she said. Of course she had. Their daughter was born on the 14th of October, 1884, healthy and loud, with Edna's auburn hair already apparent in the dark fuzz on her head and Joseph's gray-green eyes, and Howie, who was 4, was brought in to meet her with the careful gravity of a child who has been told that this is important. He stood next to the bed and looked at the baby with the focused assessment that was entirely his mother's expression on his father's face. "She is very small," he said. She was bigger inside, Edna said. Howie considered this and apparently found it acceptable. "What's her name?" he asked. Joseph and Edna looked at each other. "Clara," Joseph said. It was the first time he had said the name to Edna, had offered it rather than fled from it, and she understood immediately and completely what he was doing and what it cost and what it meant, and she held his gaze with those steady brown eyes and nodded. "Clara Rose Shelby," Edna said. "That's a pretty name," Howie said, returning his attention to his sister. Joseph held his daughter and felt the complicated, honest truth of holding something precious by the name of a thing he had lost, and found that it was not painful in the way he had feared it would be, that there was enough room in a heart, apparently, for grief and joy to exist alongside each other, without canceling either one out. Clara Rose Shelby grew into a child of startling energy and considerable opinions, which surprised no one who knew her parents. She was walking at 10 months and talking in full sentences by 18 months, and by the time she was 3 had established a firm position in the household as a person whose views on any subject would be heard and responded to on their merits. Howard Fairchild, who was now 70 and moving more slowly but whose mind was entirely unimpaired, treated both grandchildren as intellectual equals, and was rewarded by the fact that both of them adored him with a completeness that was one of the greatest joys of his last years. He died in the spring of 1886, quietly in the back room on a warm April morning, and they found him with a book open on his chest and the expression of a man who had gone somewhere comfortable. Edna sat with him for a long time, holding his hand, and Joseph sat with her, and there was nothing to say that the grief did not say more eloquently, and so they said very little. They buried him in the Caldwell cemetery under a cottonwood tree that was full of new green leaves that April, and Edna wrote to Howard's old friends in Lawrence, and the letters she received back from them were full of the things that people had loved about him, and she kept them in a box with his letters to her. All of it, the record of being known and loved by someone from the beginning. That fall she told the children about their grandfather in the way she told them everything honestly and fully, with space for their grief and their questions. And Howie, who was 6 and old enough to understand something of it, said, "He knew everything," and Edna said, "He knew a great deal," and Joseph said, "He knew what mattered," and Howie thought about this for a long time. The years moved through as years do, each one shaped by its season and its work, and the particular texture of living in a place where you know everyone and are known. Caldwell grew and changed, the cattle era beginning to shift as the trail drives gave way to the railways, and the open range began to contract under the pressure of settlement and barbed wire. And Joseph watched these changes with the measured attention of a man who has seen enough of the world's habits to know that things change, and that what matters is whether the things you've built together are strong enough to endure the changing. The house on the south end of Caldwell had 3 more bookshelves by 1887, and a proper garden that Edna managed with the systematic intelligence she brought to all her projects, growing vegetables through the summer with the productivity of someone who dislikes waste. Joseph added a room to the east side of the house in the summer of 1885, because Clara needed a room of her own on grounds that she expressed clearly and at length, and the room had a window that faced east so she could watch the morning come in, which she did with great seriousness from the time she was old enough to climb out of bed under her own power. Howie was a serious, thoughtful child who grew into a serious, thoughtful boy, with his father's quiet and his mother's precision, and a gift for mathematics that emerged at 8 years old and delighted Edna professionally and personally. He spent hours with pencil and paper working out problems that he invented for himself, and Edna fed him every mathematical text she could obtain through correspondence with a bookseller in Kansas City, and by the time he was 12, he had surpassed what she could teach him, and she was writing letters on his behalf to a secondary school in Wichita. Clara was different. Clara was noise and motion, and the blunt, energetic certainty of a person who knows what she thinks and is not particularly interested in waiting for permission to say it. She was her mother's daughter in argument, her father's daughter in stubbornness, and her grandfather's grandchild in the fierce, comprehensive love of books that had taken hold of her at 3 years old and never once loosened. She read faster than Howie and retained more, though Howie organized what he retained with more precision, and their arguments about books, which began around 1888 and never quite ended, were among the most reliably entertaining things in the Shelby household. Joseph watched them both with the kind of love that has no performance in it, the love that simply is, present and constant and expressed in the daily work of being their father, in the way he listened to them, and the way he took their ideas seriously, and the way he taught them the things he knew about the land and the horses and the necessary work of caring for what you are responsible for. He took Howie on fence rides when the boy was old enough to sit a horse reliably, teaching him the same way he had taught himself to see the land, as a system of relationships rather than a collection of obstacles. He took Clara too, though she was more interested in the why of things than the how, asking questions about the grass and the soil and the weather and the birds with a thoroughness that would have exhausted a less patient man. He answered all of them, every one. Edna watched him with the children and felt, regularly and without diminishment, the kind of gratitude that is not separate from love but is one of its expressions, the recognition that this man, who had been closed like a locked room, had opened himself so thoroughly that there was room for all of them inside. Room and warmth and the willingness to keep showing up, every day, for all the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable demands of being loved and being loved back. She said this to him once on an evening in 1889, sitting on the porch of the house in the warm September dark, the children inside and Howard Fairchild's chess set on the table between them, though neither of them was playing, just sitting. "I want you to know," she said, "that I know what I have." He turned to look at her. "Do you," she said, "know what you have?" He looked at the house behind them, the bookshelves visible through the window, the lamp light, the sound of Howie and Clara in some sustained disagreement about something. "Yes," he said, "I know." She reached across and took his hand in the dark. "Good," she said. They sat on the porch in the September night, and the stars were very clear over the Kansas plain, and the crickets were doing their last work of the season before the cold came again. And the sounds from inside the house were the sounds of their children, their ordinary, remarkable, daily life children, and Joseph Shelby held his wife's hand and thought about the man he had been, and the man he was, and the distance between them. He had been unreachable. He had believed himself unreachable, had built the unreachability carefully and deliberately, stone by stone in the years after Clara's death, until he was something sealed against entry, against caring, against the risk of being broken by what you loved. He had been very thorough about it. And Edna Fairchild had come down the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, on a September day in 1878, with a runaway wagon and a calm voice and eyes that looked at things as they actually were, and she had not tried to break through anything. She had not applied herself to the project of reaching him. She had simply been herself, completely and without artifice, and the unreachability had failed because there is no defense adequate to something that real. She had reached him before the first snow. He was entirely certain of this, though the moment was harder to locate than the first snow itself, which had come on the 17th of November and which he remembered precisely. The reaching had been earlier than that, earlier than the supper at the hotel and the laugh that surprised him, possibly as early as the wagon and the frightened horse, possibly in the moment she had said, "I am not," a simple undertaking with the same unadorned honesty she brought to everything. He had never recovered. This, too, was completely accurate. Joseph Shelby, the foreman of the Garrett Ranch, husband of Edna and father of Howie and Clara, was not the same person who had ridden into Caldwell on a dusty autumn morning with his brim pulled low and no interest in anything a town had to offer. That man was gone, replaced by someone who laughed at dinner and argued about Emerson and built bookshelves, and held his children, and sat on the porch of his house on September evenings holding his wife's hand in the dark, entirely and permanently undone by the specific force of being fully known by someone who found that knowledge worth holding. He had not recovered, and he had no desire to. The autumn of 1891 brought Howie's acceptance to the secondary school in Wichita, a letter that arrived on an October afternoon when Edna was at school and Joseph was in the kitchen working through accounts, and he held the letter and read it twice, and then walked to the school in the October afternoon and waited outside the door and handed it to her when she emerged, and she read it once, quickly, and then read it again, and then pressed both hands over her mouth, and her eyes went bright, and she looked at Joseph, and he looked back, and they held the thing between them, the enormous, ordinary miracle of it. Howie went to Wichita the following January, which was hard in the way that all departures are hard, the house different in his absence, Clara loudly protesting the injustice of being left behind while simultaneously planning with great efficiency how she would occupy the additional space, and Edna writing to Howie twice a week, with the faithfulness of someone who understands that correspondence is a form of love, and that 14-year-old boys in new places need to know that home is still there. Joseph rode to Wichita to visit Howie twice in his first year, making the journey on Cutter's successor, a reliable bay gelding Howie had named captain and who had taken over from the original Cutter with admirable professionalism, and he sat with his son in the school's common room, and they talked about mathematics and the cattle business and whether barbed wire was going to change the ranching world irrevocably, which it was. Howie had Edna's brain and Joseph's quiet and Howard Fairchild's breadth of interest, and he was going to be something, Joseph thought, that none of them had quite mapped yet, and this was right. Clara, meanwhile, was 11 years old and fully in possession of her opinions and her father's stubbornness and her mother's intellectual appetite, and the combined result was a child that the current teacher at the Caldwell school, hired when Edna moved to a supervisory role on the school board, referred to privately as challenging, and that Edna referred to, with enormous pride and only moderate apology, as engaged. She was going to be something too. By 1893, Caldwell was a different town than the one Edna had arrived at in 1878. The great cattle drives were over, the Kishome Trail largely a memory now that the railroads had remapped the logistics of moving beef, and the town had settled into a quieter kind of itself, the frontier roughness smoothed somewhat by the accumulation of years and families and institutions. The school had 40 students. There was a proper library, which Edna had been instrumental in establishing, and which had, after a sustained 5-year campaign, received a donation of books from the State Education Fund. The Garrett Ranch continued its operation in the adjusted mode of the era, less trail driving and more local market beef, and Joseph had grown into his foreman role with the same gradual, thorough competence he brought to everything, earning the respect of the hands under him in the way that good bosses earn it, not by demanding it but by being worth it. On the evening of their 15th wedding anniversary, the 14th of March, 1894, Joseph and Edna sat in the front room among the bookshelves. Clara was 14 and with a friend's family for the evening. Howie was at school in Wichita finishing his final year. The house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when it was just the two of them, which was a different quiet from solitude and from the noise of the children, its own specific frequency, warm and familiar, and full of the accumulated texture of 15 years of shared life. He had made supper, which was not his usual contribution but which he had been planning for a week, a proper meal of the kind that required time and attention, and she had come in from her meeting at the school board and found the table set and the food ready, and had looked at him with the expression that still did to his chest what it had always done. 15 years, she said. Yes. I would do all of it again, she said, every single day of it. So would I, he said, including the parts that were hard. Especially those, she agreed. They ate supper and talked about everything and nothing in the easy way of people who have run out of subjects they haven't already discussed and have discovered that this means they can discuss anything. And after dinner he went to the bookshelf and came back with a package. She unwrapped it. It was a new edition of the Whitman, because the first one had been read so many times that it had lost its cover, and was held together with a piece of leather cord she had tied around it with the matter-of-fact resourcefulness that had always been one of his favorite things about her. She held the new book and looked at the old one on the table beside it and then at him. "You kept it," she said. "Of course I kept it," he said. She set the new book on the table and picked up the old one, the cord-wrapped, coverless, beloved old one, and opened it and read him a passage she knew by heart, the same one she had read him on the first evening of the book, and he sat across from her and listened with the whole of his attention and thought that this was true, what Whitman said about the body and the soul being one thing, about the world being full of signals and meanings if you were willing to receive them. He had not been willing for so long. He was willing now. He was wholly and unreservedly willing. Howie came home from Wichita in June of 1894 and took a position at the Wichita Land Office through a connection made at school, working in cartography and land surveying, which was exactly the kind of work that required mathematics and the ability to read landscape and the patience to be precise, all of which he had in abundance. He came home to Caldwell for Christmas and for the summer, and he was taller than Joseph by then, and had his mother's way of making everyone in a room feel considered. Clara finished her schooling in Caldwell in 1895 and announced that she intended to attend college, and said this to both parents on a Sunday morning over breakfast with the confidence of someone who has decided the matter and is sharing rather than requesting, which was so entirely Clara that neither of them could have been surprised and neither of them was. Joseph and Edna looked at each other across the table. "The normal school in Emporia has a women's course," Edna said. "I know," Clara said. "I've already written to them." "Of course you have," Joseph said. She went to Emporia in the fall of 1895, 15 years old and fierce with purpose, and Edna wrote her twice a week, and Joseph once a week, and her letters back were long and full of what she was learning and arguing about. And they read them aloud to each other in the evenings by the fire, and found in them the particular pleasure of watching a person you love becoming more fully themselves. Joseph Shelby at 48 was a man who had lived a full life and knew it. The lines in his face were the lines of weather and years of outdoor work, and some of them were the lines of having laughed considerably more than he had expected to when he rode into Caldwell in the autumn of 1878. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and he moved with the deliberateness of a body that has given a great deal and maintained itself well. And he rode Captain out to the fence lines in the morning, and came home in the evenings, and sat down to supper with his wife in the house full of books. He and Edna were, in 1896, in their 18th year together, and what they had between them was not the frantic thing of early love, but something rooted and complex and full of history. The love of two people who know each other to the bottom and have found the bottom solid, who have been through years and illness and grief and difficulty, and come out of all of it still choosing, still reaching for each other's hand in the dark. She was 44 and still taught, now as a senior instructor at the expanded Caldwell School, still argued with the school board about curricula with the same undefeated persistence, still walked with the purposeful, unhurried stride he had watched from his horse in all the early weeks of knowing her, still read voraciously and argued about everything she read, and looked at him across the dinner table with those direct brown eyes that still had the same quality they'd always had, the quality of actually seeing him. She was the best thing he had ever known. He told her this, not frequently enough for his own satisfaction, but with the sincerity that she had always been able to tell from performance, and she received it the way she received everything he offered her, fully and without diminishment, and with a return that was equal to its weight. One evening in the fall of 1896, they sat on the porch as they so often did, the air carrying the edge of October in it, the cottonwood at the corner of the street going gold, and she said, "Do you remember your first night in Caldwell?" He thought about it. "I remember the ride in. I remember the general store." "You remember the wagon," she said. "Yes." "You had the look," she said, "of a man who had made peace with being very much alone." "I had," he said. "What changed it?" she asked, not because she didn't know, but because she liked to hear it said. He looked at the gold cottonwood and the October evening sky, wide and clear and going to amber at the horizon. "You stopped being afraid of me," he said. "Every other person who talked to me in those days could feel the closed-off quality and they respected it. You didn't respect it. You treated me like a person who was capable of connection, and eventually I believed you." She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't not afraid," she said. "I told you I was frightened." "I know, that's different. You were frightened and you didn't retreat. That's the thing I needed, not someone unafraid, someone brave enough to be frightened and step toward it anyway." She looked at him. "You are," she said, "a remarkable man, Joseph Shelby." "You made me one," he said. "No," she said. "You were one already. I just showed you the door." He reached over and took her hand, and she turned her hand in his and held it, and they sat in the October evening and watched the last light go out of the western sky, and the stars came out over Caldwell one by one, and somewhere in the distance a coyote said something to the dark, and the dark received it, and the town settled into its evening sounds around them. Howie came for Christmas that year, taking the train from Wichita, and Clara came home from Emporia for the winter break, and the house was full and loud in the best possible way, and Howard Fairchild's chess set came out of the cabinet, and Joseph played 3 consecutive games against Howie and lost 2 of them and maintained his dignity. Clara read half a book on Christmas afternoon, because there was no natural law that said Christmas precluded reading, and Edna cooked more food than 6 people could eat and fed the excess to half the neighborhood. That Christmas evening, when the children were talking in the kitchen and Edna was sitting with her book and Joseph was watching the fire and the house was warm around them all, he thought about the road that had brought him here, the long circuitous road from Missouri to the Western Territories, from the war to the isolation, from Clara's grave on the plain to this room, this life, this woman reading by the fire. He had been unreachable. The town of Caldwell, Kansas in 1878 had considered him exactly that, a man sealed against entry, against community, against anything that had the capacity to matter. And they had not been wrong. He had been that man. But before the first snow fell on the 17th of November of that year, something had already happened that no sealed room can survive, which is the steady presence of someone who sees what's inside and finds it worth knowing. Edna Fairchild had not stormed his walls or dismantled his defenses or applied herself to the project of reaching him. She had simply been real completely and consistently and without performance, and reality, when it is that genuine, does not require force to make itself felt. He had never recovered. He intended to spend the rest of his life not recovering. "What are you smiling at?" Edna said from across the room, not looking up from her book. "You," he said. She did look up then. "I hope it's something good," she said. "The best," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, those warm, direct eyes, and then the corner of her mouth moved and she returned to her book, and he turned back to the fire. And outside the December night settled over Caldwell, Kansas, over the plain and the cottonwoods and the frozen creek and the schoolhouse full of books and the house full of family and the life built from the materials of 2 people who had reached each other before the first snow and had never, either of them, fully recovered, and were grateful, deeply and without reservation, for every day of the not recovering. The fire burned low and steady. The house breathed around them. The stars over Kansas were very clear. And Joseph Shelby, who had been unreachable, sat in the warmth of what had reached him and was wholly and permanently and gladly found.